Barack Obama is one of the worst things that ever happened to African people, because it was Barack Obama who engineered African command by going into Africa, making African countries think they would be benefited by U.S. military presence. Correct me if I'm wrong. No people ever got freedom, justice, and equality with the help of the people oppressing them. Are we our own worst enemy? A lot of Africans around the world, particularly here in the United States, are beginning to evolve a narrative and a philosophy that is very dangerous, that posits that African people are our own worst enemy. And I want to be very clear. I do not support the narrative that African people are our own worst enemy. We are not our own worst enemy. We are not. We may be the number one accomplice to the enemy. We may be the number one ally to the enemy. We may be our second worst enemy, but we are not our worst enemy. Simply stated, one of the reasons why we are not our worst enemy, we are too disorganized to be our worst enemy. In order to destroy an entire people, that takes a lot of ingenuity. That takes a lot of sophistication. That takes a lot of organization. That takes a lot of solidarity. In order to disadvantage an entire people for 500 years, that takes a lot of organized power. We are too disorganized to be our own worst enemy. And that's why I would argue that we may be the number one accomplice to the enemy's design to destroy us. Let's look at Africa for a minute. Let's look at the continent of Africa for a minute. You often hear Africans in the diaspora who know next to nothing about the political history and current challenges of the African continent, who like to speak out of their anus and say things like Africa should have been fixed herself by now. That is a very ignorant, uninformed statement that is often made by Africans in the diaspora to look at the mother continent, and say Africa should have fixed her problems by now. She's been independent for 60 years. And then Africans in the continent will look at Africans in America, in Canada, in Europe, and say, you guys been out of slavery for more than a century and a half. Why haven't you fixed your problems? So both perspectives are born of an ignorance of the sophistication and wicked wisdom of global white supremacy. Global white supremacy. Global white supremacy. If we look at the mother continent, I'll give you 3 reasons why Africa is still struggling right now. African people can't be blamed for the problem, but we can be blamed for the solution. I want to be clear. We did not create the problem, but we are responsible for the solutions. Jamaican Africans didn't create that problem, but they're responsible for the solution. Nigerian Africans didn't create their problems, but they're responsible for the solutions. Our African brothers and sisters in Brazil didn't create their problems, but they're responsible for the solution. Our African brothers and sisters in Suriname, they didn't create their problems, but they're responsible for the solution. Trinidad and Tobago didn't create their problems, but they're responsible for the solution. Pennsylvania Africans and New York Africans and Texas Africans and Chicago Africans and Atlanta Africans and Miami Africans, Minneapolis Africans and Omaha, Nebraska Africans, we didn't create the problems that we live in, but we're responsible for the solutions. Do not understand me when I say we're not responsible for the problem. I am not saying we are not responsible for the solution. When I say we are not responsible for the problem, I am not saying we are not responsible for the solution. We are 1000% responsible for the solution. Correct me if I'm wrong. No oppressed people ever got equality or justice from the people oppressing them. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Historians, fellow historians, correct me if I'm wrong. No people ever got freedom, justice, and equality with the help of the people oppressing them. No people ever got freedom, justice, and equality with the assistance of their oppressor. And that's what makes the American African situation so ridiculously peculiar. The American African situation is so ridiculously peculiar because we want the oppressor to help us get freedom. We want the oppressor to help us get equality. We want the oppressor to help us get justice. That has never happened in human history. And the reason we want the oppressor to help us achieve freedom, justice, and equality in the American theater, the reason we want the oppressor to help us achieve freedom, justice, and equality in the American theater is because we're too lazy. We are too politically lazy. We are too self-hating and disinterested in coming together to solve our own problems. So the American African has basically made up his mind. The Canadian African has basically made up his mind. The Africans of England and France, we have made up our minds that if we're going to get free, the white man has to play a leading role in that effort. If we're going to get free, the white man has to play a leading role in that effort. And that's ridiculous. Because if you're waiting for the government of France, if you're waiting for the government of England, if you're waiting for the government of Canada, if you're waiting for the government of America to play a role in your liberation, you will be exterminated. You will be exterminated. Your oppressor will never help you eliminate oppression. If that's the case, he would have never bothered oppressing you in the first place. We have to understand, overstand, and understand. We have to understand, overstand, and understand. We have to understand, overstand, and understand. In Africa, you cannot talk about the underdevelopment of our mother continent. You cannot talk about the underdevelopment of our mother continent, the richest continent on earth. You can't talk about the backwardsness of African reality politically without talking about neo-colonialism. If you don't talk about neo-colonialism when you talk about Africa, don't talk about Africa. If you're not going to talk about neo-colonialism when you talk about Africa, don't talk about Africa. If you're going to be that irresponsible to talk about the problems back home in Africa without talking about neo-colonialism, don't talk about Africa. Because you can't understand Africa without understanding the manipulation of the unseen European hand. If you don't deal with the unseen European hand in Africa, you can never deal with Africa. You must deal with the unseen European hand. That's right. The unseen hand of the French government, the unseen hand of the Belgian government in the Congo, the unseen hand of the Portuguese government in the former Portuguese colonies. Don't talk about Africa if you're not going to talk about the unseen hand of the United States of America, the unseen hand of the United Kingdom. Same thing with the Caribbean countries. Same thing with the Caribbean islands. You can't talk about Jamaica without talking about the unseen hand of America, UK, and now China. Now China. And when I get to Ethiopia for African Liberation Day, God willing, when I get to Ethiopia for African Liberation Day on May 25th, we have to talk about the Chinese, because the Chinese are making inroads in Ethiopia. So not only do we have an unseen white hand, we now have an unseen yellow hand. We not only have an unseen white hand in Africa, we now have an unseen yellow hand in Africa. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Let us not leave out the Dutch. Let us not leave out the Dutch and what they do to the brothers and sisters in Amsterdam and Rotterdam throughout the Netherlands. Let us not forget about the Dutch and what they do in South Africa. Let us not forget about the Dutch and what they do in the so-called Dutch West Indian Islands, the Curacao, Bonaire, Aruba, Saint Martin. Let's not forget about the Dutch colonizers. Let's not forget about the colonizers. So you have to deal with neo-colonialism in Africa. And if you're going to deal with neo-colonialism in Africa, you got to deal with the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. You have to deal with the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and Barack Obama's Africom. You have to deal with the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and Barack Obama's Africom. Oh, yes. Because you got to deal with the World Bank that keeps Africa underdeveloped. You got to deal with the International Monetary Fund that exploits Africa in the name of loans. And you have to deal with Africom, Barack Obama's African Command, that is fueling and funding coups in every African country that is either siding with the Chinese or isn't going along with the agenda of Washington, D.C. Barack Obama is one of the worst things that ever happened to African people, because it was Barack Obama who engineered African Command by going into Africa, making African countries think they would be benefited by U.S. military presence, making African leaders think that they will be benefited by U.S. military presence, making African leaders think they will be benefited by U.S. military presence. African leaders aren't benefited by U.S. military presence. They didn't bring the U.S. military into Africa to protect you. They brought the U.S. military into Africa to overthrow you when you don't do what they want you to do. If you look at 90% of the coups in Africa over the past 10 years, 90% of the coups in Africa, the overthrow of democratically elected leaders, 90% of the coups in Africa were in countries that have what? Barack Obama Africom bases. 90% of the coups in Africa since 2013 have been in countries that have Africom military bases. Is that a coincidence? Is that a coincidence? African leaders, get rid of Africom. African leaders, get rid of Africom. African leaders, get rid of Africom. But most African leaders are afraid to get rid of Africom because they know Africom has trained so many agent provocateurs throughout the continent. Africom has trained so many agent provocateurs. Africom has trained so many agent provocateurs throughout Africa that the African leaders that have Africom military bases are afraid to throw them out. And Barack Obama is a hero to you ninjas. Barack Obama is a hero to you ninjas. Barack Obama is a hero to you ninjas. I remember when Obama was running. I was in Nigeria during the Obama campaign, the first one. I was in Nigeria during the Obama campaign. I was in South Africa during 2008, the Obama campaign, and Africans in Nigeria, Africans in South Africa swore to me up and down Barack Obama would be a blessing. Even in Africa, we thought Barack Obama would be a blessing. Even in Africa, we thought Barack Obama would be a blessing. Brothers and sisters, Africa is kept backwards by the unseen hand of the white man and the yellow man. Make no mistake about it. Make no mistake about it. The Caribbean islands are kept like that due to the unseen hand of the white man and the yellow man. And their major weapon is self-serving, disingenuous African leadership. Their major weapon is self-serving, disingenuous African leadership. Their major weapon is self-serving, disingenuous, Western-trained African leadership.
We need to stop going into the public domain, making politically irresponsible, dangerous, and ridiculous comments. Amber Geiger and the forgiving of white police killers is another public pronouncement we need to stop making.